Hello and welcome to our panel discussion today. My name is Sandra Healy and I'm Head of Equality, Diversity and Inclusion for Dublin City University. Today, the focus of our panel is work, welfare, tax and pension, and family-friendly policies and support. And firstly, I'd like to thank each of the panelists for preparing their briefing and key recommendation documents for the Citizens' Assembly. The aim of the panel today is to briefly discuss and explore some of the key points and recommendations that were made in the documents. And before we get started, I'd like to invite each panelist to briefly introduce themselves and their organisation.
Hi Sandra, and hello to all the citizens. My name is Sandra McCullagh and I'm the Women's Economic Equality Coordinator with the National Women's Council. So the Women's Council is the leading national representative organisation for women and women's groups in Ireland. My work there focuses on economic equality, inequalities experienced by women in the areas of work, social welfare, pensions and care.
Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Laura Bambrick. I'm Head of Social Policy with the Irish Congress of Trade Unions. So ICTU is the umbrella body for 44 separate unions, and together we represent the interests of some 700,000 workers in all sectors of the economy across the island.
Bríd, I'd like to invite you to introduce yourself.
Hi, how are you? My name is Bríd O'Brien and I work with the Irish National Organisation of the Unemployed. We are a membership organisation consisting of organisations working on the ground on unemployment and related issues, and also individual members, people who are unemployed themselves and who participate in the running of the organisation. I'm Head of Policy and Media with the organisation, and further information is available on our website. Thank you.
Thank you. So Sandra, I'd like to start with the first question with yourself. You mentioned in your document that individual access to payments and the issue of QA qualified adults, and you mentioned that 90% of qualified adults are women. Can you take us through the impact of this and what do you think is required for this to change?
Sure, thanks Sandra. So I suppose our welfare system was built for a very different era on a male breadwinner understanding of the labour market and the social welfare systems. So at the moment, welfare payments to two-parent families comprise a payment for the main claimant and what's then called the qualified adult payment for additional adults in the household. So while in theory the system is gender neutral, in practice around 90% of qualified adults are women. So I was saying the system creates a relationship of dependency for qualified adults. They don't receive an income in their own right, and they also can't access many of the various training and employment supports that come with payments. For women of pension age then, it is such a blow to their dignity and independence after providing a lifetime of care to then find out they're not entitled to a pension in their own right. Rather, their partner receives a top up to his pension for having a dependent spouse. So in terms of what's needed, we really want to see this system of dependency abolished, and in its place an individualised approach where women and men would receive a social welfare payment in their own right and have individual entitlement to all of the supports that accompany a social payment.
Yeah, and Sandra, can I ask, is this something that has been raised before?
It has, yes. So, I mean, we have looked at reform of the social welfare system over many years. And actually just recently, the National Economic and Social Council, which is an organisation made up of government appointed representatives of various sectors, heads of government departments and so on, they also actually recommended that we would need to look at individualising our social welfare.
Okay, great, thank you. And Bríd, can I turn to you now for the next question? In your document, you mentioned the SILC survey and how it collects data on a range of income and it quantifies the at-risk of poverty rate and the deprivation rate. And when I was reading this, the numbers in it seem quite stark. Could you tell us more about this, please?
Yes, I mean, this is information that's collected by the Central Statistics Office. They publish it on a yearly basis, usually relating to the year before. And amongst the key data collected is the at-risk of poverty rate, the deprivation rate, and the consistent poverty rate, which combines the two. And it's very striking that there are particular groups of people who experience deprivation and poverty more so than, say, at the national level. And they will be people who will be unemployed, people who will be living in households that are jobless, families that say where there's people parenting alone, and those families are invariably headed by women. And so again, just like looking at the national figures, you know, the at risk of poverty rate was 12.8. For people who were unemployed, it was 35.4. The deprivation rate was 17.8. For people who were parenting alone, again, that was considerably higher, it was 45.4. So these are very stark figures. So we really need a social welfare system that addresses the issue of adequacy. There is a commitment in the roadmap for social inclusion to look at the whole area of benchmarking. And we feel then that really needs, the benchmarks that need to be used are lifting people above the poverty line and ensuring people can meet a minimal essential standard of living. So in households, invariably it is the women who are managing the household income who are trying to manage, and then there are other households where those households are invariably headed by women on their own. So really this is an important issue that must be addressed. We must address the issue of income adequacy.
Yeah, and Bríd, I noticed in the figures were very high for people who are living with an illness or a disability.
Yes.
Like I think it was up over 43%. Like that's...
Yes, for the deprivation rate for people of an illness is 43.3, and then likewise, you know, the at-risk of poverty rate for people who have a disability is again very stark in comparison to other groups. It's 37.5. They would be the group with the highest rate at risk of poverty rate. So again, I think it just highlights the need to ensure that we have a system that lifts people above the poverty line and that ensures they can meet a minimal essential standard of living.
Okay, great. Thank you, Bríd. Something else I noticed in reading your document is you talked about the Public Employment Service and how your recommendation is that this should be accessible to everybody of working age. You might take us through that, please.
Sure. Yeah, no, again, for us, this is very important. Since it's almost a decade now since the Department of Social Protection absorbed the service, which previously had been provided by FÁS, which some people may remember and others won't. And then what happened was they very much rolled it out as an activation service and very much linked to people being in receipt of an income. And as Sandra has already highlighted, you know, that there are many women who are not in receipt of an income in their own right. Now, we are assured at departmental level that people can call into the local intro office and seek access to a service, but we've had lots of feedback from people on the ground that that is not so easily done. So we really do need to have a system that is a public employment service that really tries to provide good advice to people, be they in work and trying to change work. Particularly, I think the current crisis highlights how vulnerable a lot of employment is. For people maybe who have been out of work, they could have been involved in caring duties and would now like to go back into paid employment, and they are invariably women. So that the system is really does try and work with the individual, work with them regardless of their circumstances, and really looks to see, well, what kind of supports do they need? How can they support them? What kind of information do they need? How can they support people to access a good job, a decent job? And if people need to reskilling, you know, to be able to access that. But good advice, finding a job is a job in itself. And so people really do need to know there's a service that is there for them, regardless of whether or not they're on a welfare payment.
Yeah, that sounds like a really good approach, Bríd. So thank you for taking us through that. Laura, could I turn to you for a moment and just talk about something that you had mentioned in your document? So you had mentioned about the EU directive on work-life balance and the impact that this will have on parents and carers in Ireland, and how if the new right to flexible working is not extended to all workers, that this potentially could negatively impair women's careers and women's progression. Can you tell us more about this directive, please?
Thanks, Sandra. So Irish workers are really unusual in a European context in that they don't have the right to request flexible working arrangements. So workers in Northern Ireland, in the UK and across the EU, once they've completed their 6 months probation period, they can request from their employer that they can work part-time, term time, flexible start and finish, and now very topical, they can work remotely. So what this means is once the worker requested, their employer has to give some reasonable consideration into why or why not the worker can't have this flexibility. Irish workers don't have that protection in law, so their employers can dismiss the request out of hand. So the good news is this new EU directive is going to give this new right to flexible working arrangements to the parents of young children up to the age of 8 and carers. Now, ICTU's concern is if this new right is limited to this limited group, which is predominantly women, what we're going to see is when the expected boom in remote working happens, it's going to become highly feminized. And looking at the research from the US, it shows that remote workers are more likely to be overlooked for training opportunities and promotion. So our fear is that remote working, if limited to women, mothers and carers, it's going to end up, as I said, being highly feminized and have personal consequences. So we're recommending that it be given this new right to all workers to help them balance work-life balance and there be no consequences for their career progression.
Yeah, and it's quite topical now, Laura, I suppose, considering that we have probably most people in the country working from home. So it sounds like a perfect opportunity really to be considering this and how it potentially could, I suppose, help balance the burden, if I can call it that, of childcare and carer duties. I don't think in the document it said anything about when the directive is coming in, or do you have any information around that?
So the directive was signed off in 2019, so just ahead of the outbreak of COVID, and the Irish government have until 2022. They had 3 years to implement it. So as you said, very timely. COVID has made this very, very relevant. And
Sandra, if you don't mind, I'd come back to you. You mentioned in your document about a participation income to value care. Can you tell us more about this? This seems quite an interesting approach.
Sure. So, Laura has been talking there about kind of the balance and work-life balance and balancing care. And I suppose, our welfare system really needs to be reformed so that it recognises and values care and supports both women and men to share care. Because one of the issues with the current system is that eligibility for job seekers payments, it requires women to prove they can work full time, as well as being able to provide for care responsibilities. If a woman can't satisfy these conditions, then she can't access a payment or the associated supports. The system prioritises participation in the labour market above all other forms of work, including care. So participation income would be an alternative in that it would recognise other meaningful contributions that add to the common good. It would enable both women and men to choose among and kind of to combine paid employment with caregiving and with other socially valuable work, such as voluntary or environmental work. So countries like the Netherlands, for example, have taken steps towards a system that takes care and other forms of contribution into account. So unlike our system here that requires people to seek full-time work, the Dutch system acknowledges part-time work as a legitimate choice, and it also gives people who are caring for children under 12 the right to access unemployment benefit. So it's not just the Women's Council calling for this. I mentioned NESC earlier, that kind of government-appointed body, and again, NESC have recommended just only in the last couple of weeks that we pilot a participation income system. I suppose introducing a participation income would mean that instead of kind of reinforcing an outdated view of women's role as being in the home and as a dependent of her partner, the social welfare system would promote gender equality and support women and men to share care responsibilities.
Yeah, it seems quite progressive. It's good to hear that it is something that is kind of tried and tested from another country. So thank you for taking us through that, Sandra. Laura, do you mind if I turn to you now? And I think all of you at some point in your documents have spoken about pensions. But Laura, I have a question in particular for yourself. In your document, you raised the issue of the state pension in 2012. The paid contribution condition was doubled and how this makes it more difficult for women to qualify for a pension. And you mentioned a solution from the UK. Can you take us through this, please?
Yes, Sandra. So I suppose it's very similar to what the National Women's Council mentioned about the distinction between a contribution that comes from care and a contribution that comes from paid employment. So the preference for the Irish Congress of Trade Unions is to follow the UK example, where the system doesn't distinguish between credited contributions that women can accumulate for years spent providing care either to a child or a dependent adult, and those spent in paid employment, because a small change that was made in 2012, in which pensioners were required to have spent at least 10 years over their working lives in paid employment, has made it more difficult for predominantly women to get a pension in their own right. So if we lost this distinction between time spent caring and time spent in paid employment, it would increase the number of women that have a pension in their own right. So that's the solution we see. Follow the UK example. It's working very well there.
Very good, thank you. And Sandra, I think that just it links into something that you had mentioned in your document around pensions, where you raised the issue of older women who are expected by society to shoulder the full burden of care for no pay. And I suppose the legacy and the impact of the marriage bar that's had, I suppose it does in some ways links to some of the points that Laura has raised.
Yeah, I mean, Laura is absolutely right. All of the issues that women experience in their working lives, all the things we've been talking about, the low pay, the unequal care responsibilities, they all make it really difficult to collect enough PRSI contributions to be eligible for a pension. And thousands of women are still experiencing the marriage bar. And, you know, taken together, they all culminate in a gender pensions gap of 35%. And according to the CSO, 1 in 4 women over the age of 65 is at risk of poverty. I suppose from our research and kind of years of working directly with older women, for us, the best way to provide an adequate income to all older men and women is through a universal pension to guarantee income adequacy in older age.
That's brilliant. So I wish we had more time. I think yeah, all of the topics that we've covered today, though brief, I think are very interesting. And I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to brief the citizens. Laura Bambrick from ICTU, thank you. Sandra McCullagh, National Women's Council, and Bríd O'Brien from INOU, thank you very much for your contribution today. Thank you.